think it is balance, but it's also about different for different people, and I don't think there's one right balance for all of us. For some people, probably even a small amount of social media might be harmful, and for some people, it might go the other way, that they can really thrive with lots and lots of social media. But for the next person, that might be really harmful. So, we're all individuals, and there's a risk, I guess, that we think that what works for us is going to work for someone else, and actually, we might find social media really helpful or harmful, but the next person or our kids might have quite a different experience of it. So it's important, and that, I guess, that's one of the things that's one of the, going back to an earlier question, that's one of the advantages talking to a therapist, is that they're less likely, perhaps, than a friend to take particular sides.
Hi, Mick.
Hey, Paul.
Hey, thanks for joining me today. So I just want to ask, sort of from the outset, what is the difference between counselling and psychotherapy?
Well, there's no kind of hard and fast definition, but psychotherapy tends to be longer. Psychotherapists tend to have, not always, but tend to have more training than counsellors. But you can get very experienced counsellors and less experienced psychotherapists. Yeah. Counselling tends to be a bit more kind of frontline, talking to someone. You might have a debt counsellor, you wouldn't really have a debt psychotherapist. But counselling can be very, very in-depth. And so there's no kind of formal definition of either term, really. And there's a lot of arguments about which one's which. But they're both kind of talking therapies that try and help you address issues in your life, reach personal goals, overcome areas in your life that are distressed. Although, having said that, they might use arts and creative methods and play as well with kids.
I see. So what would be the difference between the type of, or the reasons why somebody would visit a counsellor versus a psychotherapist?
It can really overlap a lot. People feeling low, anxious about stuff, issues around the childhood or around relationships, you might really see either. But if it was things like kind of life issues, like, for instance, financial issues, possibly relationships, you might be a bit more likely to see someone who was a counsellor. And if it was more kind of going a long way deeply into your past, you might be a bit more likely to see a psychotherapist. But it really does vary. And as I say, there's counsellors who'd work on very in-depth past-related issues. There is some work at the moment, something called Scope, which is trying to kind of standardise more who offers what and what it's called, which kind of relates to that counselling psychotherapy distinction. But it's still very much something that's a kind of work in progress.
And also, I think both probably counselling and psychotherapy have got probably slightly bad press or a kind of tainted reputation sometimes as something that, you don't need to see that, you don't need to do that. Why is that perception?
There is a kind of bit of a stiff upper lip sometimes in the UK that you don't need to talk through your problems, but I think it's changing. I think the younger generation are probably more open to it. I think the research shows fairly clearly that for a lot of people, not everybody, but for a lot of people, those talking therapies can help. Public figures, royalty have, talked about the values of different therapies, and hopefully we're moving towards a culture which people can be more open about emotional difficulties. Therapy is not the only way of dealing with it. There's lots of different things you can do, but the general principle of kind of addressing emotional difficulties rather than avoiding them, in the same way that if you got a symptom of, something worrying, you're better off going to see your doctor than not, is a generally good thing.
Yeah. Is there an advantage in seeing somebody that you don't know versus talking about the same issues with someone that you do know? Is there value in it being a stranger?
I think there's benefits and disbenefits, if you like. I mean, the benefit is that if you see a counsellor psychotherapist, they're going to have training. And although somebody might have training, and they're likely to know particularly methods or techniques or way of working that have kind of got an evidence base for being helpful. But a lot of things that lay people do and friends do can be really, really helpful as well. And the evidence shows that lay people can be really talking about your problems with a friend can be really valuable. Not everybody has friends that they can talk to. A lot of the time it becomes a therapist because they don't feel comfortable talking to even close friends. There might be problems that they don't want to talk to about, or not just that. When we did research around school counselling, for instance, kids would say things not just they didn't want to talk about stuff because it was secret from their parents, but sometimes they didn't want to burden the parents, and sometimes people don't want to burden those around them and find it easier to, if you're paying someone or you're seeing someone through the NHS and that's their role, then it feels less like you have to. Sometimes people feel they have to give something if they're kind of receiving support, and having a therapist can feel like it's more one way, can be more beneficial. But groups, being in groups, having friendship groups, those things are really important as well. So it's not a kind of either or. It's very much all these different things can be helpful for different people at different points in time.
I think often a combination of the two is probably the most beneficial.
Certainly, there's very good evidence that having good supportive networks is really good for your mental health and well-being, and having friendships. Pretty much for a lot of people. You can't say for everyone, but the research would certainly show that having good, close relationships where you can talk to people about stuff is good for your mental health and well-being, and that people who are more depressed, more anxious, tend to have less of that in their lives.
Do you also think that there's something about seeing somebody who's a qualified expert, and you go in there knowing that it makes you feel like you're, it's almost there's like a placebo effect almost?
There's certainly hope. The research shows that hope and a belief in the efficacy of what's going to happen, that what you're doing is going to be helpful, does make a difference. So feeling like you're seeing somebody who is trained and who you see is credible and you have faith in is an important part of any kind of healing process. I guess same with doctor, really, that if you didn't think a doctor was going to be able to do anything good to you, it would probably affect to some extent what happened in that interaction. So it's always kind of important to have that kind of faith and trust, and that's certainly true for the talking therapies.
Because there is, and people talk a lot about a kind of mental health crisis today. Do you see a bigger role for mental health professionals now more than ever in terms of their role, not just in people's lives, but in society?
You have to be cautious. A lot of counsellors will say that the very definition of their role is that they want to be somebody that somebody doesn't need after a particular period of time. Any good counsellor or psychotherapist is hoping that people will get to the point where they don't need counsellor or psychotherapist anymore. And, certainly myself, it's not something I'd kind of be flag waving about or saying that this is something that everybody needs to do and that everybody should have therapy. I think lots of people have really good levels of well-being, mental well-being, without therapy. But I think we are getting I'd like to think we're getting a more emotionally literate country and society, maybe even where people, as we were saying earlier, feel more able to talk about mental health problems. Mental health is a massive area of people's lives. If people are depressed or if people are anxious, it can damage not just their lives but the lives of people around them. So having ways that we can address that, and having social policies, having political agendas, having education that helps people find ways of thriving as much as possible psychologically, makes inordinate amount of sense to me. And I think the kind of and I think we are, and I think because it makes sense, we're kind of moving slowly in that direction. And the idea that we just shouldn't talk about these things, end of the day, just doesn't make massive amount of sense, really. Obviously there is a danger that the more you talk about it, the more you talk about yourself into having problems. There's what you'd call iatrogenic, that if you if something becomes so familiar that it can end up creating a problem that you're thinking about. But generally with so many of these things that, kind of information, transparency, honest, being open about that tends to be a more positive way. And I think we are seeing, there are more with young people. It's really important to look at the evidence, but I think the evidence is showing, for instance, that there are more mental health problems these days, and therefore perhaps more of a need to look at how we address these things. And it is becoming more urgent. Certainly a lot of people talk about a mental health crisis in young people, and there is, I think, some evidence that it is getting worse.
So do you think that age makes a difference in terms of how people deal with problems and process them mentally and psychologically, or does it make no difference? People do we react the same no matter what stage in life we're at?
It's a good question, and I don't know the evidence on that. I mean, I think there's certainly a generational thing. If you went back 100 years, attitudes towards mental health and therapy would be very different to what they are now, as we've been discussing. Do people talk differently as they get older? I don't know the answer to that one. It's an interesting question. I don't know.
It would be interesting to know. I think just based on my own experience, I think how I see the world now is very different to how I would have as a young person. And I think life lessons as you get older help you process challenges, help you cope with them. I think at a younger age, you're more fresh and might be more naive, and therefore might be more vulnerable to some of the difficulties.
Yeah, I mean, that may well be true. I think that as people get older, though, they do also have a lot of vulnerability. If you look at suicide statistics, there's a lot of older men who are taking their lives because they are really struggling and in enormous amounts of psychological anguish. So although it might be that people get more resilient or feel more resilient as they get older, certainly there's a lot of older people who would potentially benefit from more psychological support. And it can, depression, anxiety can hit us at any point in our lives, really. And at those points, it can be useful to get the support that might be helpful.
And do you have any insight into why that you just mentioned about the suicide rate amongst men being higher? In your research, is there anything that's come to light as to what explains that?
I don't know that research well enough to comment on it, but one possible reason, I guess, is that men do feel a lot of shame about not being well, and that they feel that they should be in control, and that they find it more difficult to talk then about kind of personal problems. There's a lot of men who, particularly, I think probably more than women, see it as a sign of weakness if they're feeling low or feeling anxious. I think women tend to have better circles of friends who where they can talk about those problems. I mean, men will often have friends, but talking about kind of being anxious or depressed about stuff with your mates at a pub is maybe not as easy as women might sometimes feel it in their social circles. Certainly from what, I don't know the evidence again, but from what I see around me, I think women often have closer and tighter and more personal friendships where those things can be talked about. And it's very isolating, if a man is feeling really low or anxious and is very much alone with that and feels like nobody sees that or knows about that, and then there's a stress of feeling that has to be hidden and it's something that he feels ashamed about, that can lead to a really difficult, painful situation.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something in the idea that men don't share their feelings probably as much, and that probably accounts for why it can fester, it can build, and it can become long term, it can become problematic. And just in terms of you mentioned about sort of tailored approaches to therapy in terms of individual. Are there people who are the ways that we can avoid having to see a professional? Are the ways that everybody can somehow find the information or the resources or the internal strength to deal with it without external support?
I mean, there was a project a while back called 5 Ways to Wellbeing, which was about they did a really thorough review of the literature, and they identified 5 things that we can all do that will help our mental health and well-being. So one, as we've already been talking about, was about connecting and having people around us and talking about stuff and having close relationships. One was about learning and staying kind of active learners and kind of keeping on discovering things, and even as adults doing adult education and being stimulated by things. One was about kind of witnessing and just kind of recognizing the world around us, taking a bit of time to acknowledge things and to see what was there. And just being mindful. There's a lot of really good evidence on mindfulness. One was about being physically fit and staying kind of just looking after our health, because we know now that kind of health and physical health can have a real impact on our mental well-being as well. And the other one I'm going to have to look up because I can't remember it. I should know these off by heart. And sorry, the other one was giving. And so the last one is about kind of volunteering, doing stuff, being part of the community. So it's not just about kind of taking and being looked after and kind of receiving things from others. It's also about feeling that you can give to your community, and things like volunteering activities are shown to have a good impact on people's mental health. I mean, there's other things that the research shows, for instance, having a sense of meaning in life and having a feelings of purpose can be really good for us. So I think these are all things that we can do that can help us and improve our likelihood or reduce the likelihood of getting into a kind of bad way psychologically. But I don't think any of it is going to guarantee it. And at the end of the day, there's no kind of, in the same way, there's nothing that can stop us getting ill physically. We can do things like we can eat healthy and we can not smoke, but even if you don't smoke, you can still get lung cancer. And in the same way that sometimes there's things that happen to us that we can't predict or control, traumatic events, often kind of things can spiral in ways that even with good friends that we can still end up feeling low. So I guess another bit about it is, there are these ways to well-being, but also that when we're not feeling mentally well, that we think about ways that we can address that. And as we talked about, that might be talking to friends, that might be, the first port of call should always be, in a sense, talking to your GP. Would be the person to go to, whether you're thinking about a counsellor or a psychotherapist, or I mean, you might start talking to friends, but if somebody's feeling that it's a problem, then a GP is like a really good coordinating kind of person to help you think about what else you might do.
Just on that sort of point about connection, is that something that maybe because of things like the internet and social media and that lack of personal connection that some people have, do you think that could account for why we're seeing more mental health issues across society now than we have possibly, or do we see more now than we ever did? I don't know.
Well, like I say, I think the latest evidence I was hearing is that there is some evidence now that with young people that there are more mental health issues. And the expert I was listening to talking about that was saying that it does, one potential reason is more use of social media. I'm not sure it's entirely clear why. It may be to do with more kind of disconnection and less kind of time then spent kind of with friends. But all the, things like gaming, kind of time spent on Instagram and things like that. I think it's complex relationships to mental health. And I think sometimes people think, well, the problem with young people today is they spend all this time on the internet, and it's not really clear, but there is some suggestion of that. And there is, I guess the evidence is still very much emerging. It's very difficult to really test these things because you can look at, you might find, say you find an association between how much time people spend on the internet and how low their mood is. But, then you don't know whether is it the time on the internet is creating the low mood, or is it the people with the low mood are more likely to spend time sitting in their room on the internet, or is it something else causing both of them? So I think we have to be cautious about kind of saying everything's about the internet these days. And, there's also positives as well and negatives. And probably it works in different ways for different people. So for some people, it's probably really not good for their mental health in terms of then not getting out and being in touch with nature, which we also know is something, being active is important for our mental health. And certainly things like going for a run, going for a walk have all shown good benefits. So somebody sitting in a room all day, it's not going to be ideal for their mental health. But then for other people, going on Facebook or social media might be a really good way of connecting with people. And actually, they'll do much more than if they were kind of not on the internet. So it's a complex one without any kind of easy answers.
Yeah, I think it's it's a matter of balance. I think like all things, I think when it tips over into overuse or even addiction, that's when there can be, I think, probably the more negative outcomes. But as you say, it's interesting to think that, for all the bad rap it gets, social media can actually connect to people as well. So it's, there's good and bad in everything.
There's good and bad. And I think it is balanced, but it's also about different for different people. And I don't think there's one right balance for all of us. For some people, probably even a small amount of social media might be harmful, and for some people, it might go the other way, that they can really thrive with lots and lots of social media. But for the next person, that might be really harmful. So we're all individuals, and there's a risk, I guess, that we think that what works for us is going to work for someone else, and actually, we might find social media really helpful or harmful, but the next person or our kids might have quite a different experience of it. So it's important, and that, I guess, that's one of the things that's one of the, going back to an earlier question, that's one of the advantages talking to a therapist, is that they're less likely perhaps than a friend to take particular sides. Like, one of the things friends will often do is give you advice or tell you, well, I've done this, and then this is what I think you should do. And a therapist will more help you work out for yourself what is right. And people do sometimes find that difficult with their friends, that they'll tell them what they should do, or they'll tell them how they should feel. And, they may not feel that there's space for them to actually explore for themselves. What do I actually feel here? And kind of discovering that for ourselves can always take a little bit of time. It's not always immediately obvious.
Yeah, I think it helps to feel like a view is coming from an impartial person, or a person detached from your circumstance.
Yeah. But if you go and see a therapist, and you talk about something like social media, they're not going to say, well, that's good, or you're doing, you're doing too much social media, you need to stop it now. What they'll want to do is explore with you your experience of social media and how you find it and what works and what doesn't work. So there's kind of complexity and a nuance, and that independent standpoint is about helping you work out for yourself what's working and what isn't working. A lot of, particularly counsellors perhaps, will be very cautious about giving advice, because they know that that's their position, but it may not necessarily be right for you.
And what about the topic of sort of loneliness? Because again, there's a sort of epidemic really of loneliness. What psychological impact does that have? And again, to what extent does it vary from person to person?
Well, we know that loneliness, like you say, that there is a lot of loneliness about, particularly perhaps in older adults, but really across the age span. And it can be incredibly distressing for people, to be outside of community, to not be in connection with others, to not have those relationships with others. And it's not just sadness that it can bring out. We know that people, on average, not always, but on average, tend to be happiest when they're around other people. But kind of lack of social contact and good relationships is associated with high levels of anxiety, and a whole range of kind of problems, because you don't have somebody around you to bounce ideas off. You don't have that kind of validation that we get from other people. So, and again, it varies very much. Some people can thrive on their own, no doubt, but generally, on average, we do seem, we're social beings, and being isolated and cut off. And of course, being lonely doesn't mean that you don't have people that you call friends, and it doesn't mean that you don't have contact with others. But I think the most difficult loneliness is often not feeling that there's people you can really share who you are with, and that there's a lot about yourself that just nobody in the world knows. And that can be, stressful to carry that all around and feel that you have to hold that in all the time. So it's kind of psychological loneliness, really. Something I work with people who, they might have friends, they might go to the pub, they might see people, but they can still feel very, very lonely, really very fundamentally, painfully alone.
Is that something that's almost I don't know if innate's the right word, but it's something that's pre-existing, or is something that is very difficult to, it isn't something we acquire through experience? Is it something that can sometimes just be there already?
There's a lot of research now that suggests that we come into the world with both an ability and a desire to connect with others. So if you look at babies, really young babies, if they see a shape that is like a human face, they'll be more interested in it than a similar shape, but kind of maybe turned upside down so it doesn't look like a face. Voices that they're very quickly tuned to. They're very able to have a very kind of backwards and forwards conversation even before they can say words. They get that kind of rhythm. So I think there is good evidence now that we are kind of coming to the world as social beings. And that that is part of our nature, is to be in relation with others. You see that in a lot of species that are similar to kind of human beings, that they don't, I mean, some do, but mostly they don't just exist very much in isolation. It's an unnatural state just for someone to be on their own. And in our culture, sometimes we kind of emphasize individualism and the individual, and we focus very much on the individual, but that's not necessarily what's most healthy for us. And other cultures, say Eastern cultures, tend to focus more on the community and relationship. And I think most people realize that how important community and relationship is because of who we are as people.
Are there any other common themes that come up with people who are going through those kinds of difficulties? And are there ones that are even, I imagine they're also universal as well, across cultures and so on. Are there, aside from things like loneliness, and is there anything else that comes up?
Well, the question of whether it's cross-cultural is an interesting one and is very hotly debated. And I think there perhaps seem to be some kind of common, and again, I don't know the research on this brilliantly, but as far as I understand it, there are some kinds of psychological conditions, and certainly some people would argue, that are cross-cultural. And psychiatric manuals, like what's called the DSM in America, Diagnostic Statistical Manual, are based on the idea that cross cultures, there's very similar kind of disorders, illnesses, in the same way that you have cancer or diabetes across cultures. But others would argue that there are a lot of cultural influences, and that you can have disorders in one culture. I think in Japan they have a disorder of young men staying in their room and never coming out, that, for instance, are much less common in other cultures. So I think some people would say that it can be more culturally specific. I mean, the other, we talked about loneliness, and there's obviously lots of different causes and roots and reasons, but another big one is around trauma, and there's a lot of work now around trauma and the impact of trauma. And what people often talk about is what's called ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences. And there's a lot of research now that people who experience, the more ACEs people experience, these adverse events in their childhood, the more they tend to struggle as adults. And so, things like neglect, abuse, and then, also things like kind of poor parenting, kind of a lack of love when you're growing up. Those things, psychotherapy and counselling is kind of based on the assumption that a lot of it that our childhood experiences impact on how we are, and there's good evidence for that. That we can be very impacted by our childhoods. And it's complex, you know, it's not a one-to-one relationship, but if somebody, for instance, has very neglectful parents, it can leave them very much wanting maybe relationships, but not knowing how to get relationships. So they're frustrated in their life, might leave them very angry so that they push people away and then they don't have good relationships. There's a lot of different kind of pathways whereby these kind of experiences, but we're also learning more about this, and particularly around trauma and the way that that's really contained in the body, and it affects us at a very kind of powerful, deep levels in ways that sometimes do require quite intensive therapies to be able to help. Things like something called EMDR, CBT. These can be kind of quite focused therapies looking at particular traumas and helping people work through these traumas so that they can come back to better levels of functioning. And the research shows that they do work. You know, the research shows that they, I mean, not for everybody again, but that they can be very effective ways of helping people overcome and deal with effects of trauma.
Or at the very least, do they help people manage that trauma? It might not ever go away in terms of impacting their life, but they're able to function more comfortably.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of kind of exactly what the mechanisms are, I think we're still learning about that, and probably some of it is about kind of managing and coping. You know, you can't change the fact that you've experienced the trauma, but I think you can change your relationship to it, and you can also change the kind of aftershock of it through different methods and techniques that can help people be less affected by it as they kind of go on in their lives. But, you know, we can always be affected by it, and it can always come back. And that comes back to the point, really, that although there are treatments and approaches that can help reduce psychological distress, we all can have the potential to experience times when we're down and when we're low. I've certainly experienced that, and feeling that that's okay, and that doesn't make you less of a man or less of a person is really important. Sometimes these things can be quite vicious cycles, in the sense that if somebody feels low and then feels ashamed of being low or feels bad about being low, then that makes them feel more depressed, and then they feel more depressed about being more depressed. So it kind of spirals down. So having a kind of level of acceptance, which kind of says, yeah, sometimes I'm going to feel low, sometimes I'm going to feel anxious. If it's getting bad, I need to talk to someone, I need to talk to my GP, but also recognizing that, you know, that is part of the human condition is also an important, for most of us, kind of way of maintaining a good emotional health.
Well, where's the cutoff? So you mentioned about, you know, every day in our daily lives we come up against hardship and we deal with it as it comes, but what's the point? How do we identify that point where it needs to be escalated and where it needs to be dealt with professionally?
It's a difficult question. I mean, I think if somebody's not sure, there's really no harm in contacting a GP. You know, better safe than sorry. And yeah, if somebody's worried about something, then, you know, better to kind of take that step forward and talk to someone, rather than waiting to see if it escalates, waiting to see if it gets worse. It's, you know, how do you define? I guess if it's impacting on your daily life, if it's impacting upon your relationships, but, you know, there's a real spectrum, and it's really hard to say when it's a kind of problem. And, you know, if you look at things like depression and anxiety, they all have kind of specific criteria, but I think talking to somebody, you know, if you have some concerns, is probably the best strategy on that.
And what's the difference between pluralistic, existential, and humanistic types of therapy, and when would each of which be applied?
So there's lots of different kinds of therapy. The main ones, I mean, to take a step back, the main ones is what's called CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, psychodynamic therapy, and humanistic therapies are the three main schools. And then you've also got the kind of family therapy. So family therapies you would do if there's issues with the family. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, tends to be the therapy is quite active, and they'll be setting exercises and suggesting you do homework. A lot of it is about trying to change your thoughts and change your behaviors. So they might encourage you to look at how you're thinking about a situation. Like if a friend doesn't text you, they might encourage you to think about, well, what assumptions you make, and you might assume that they don't like you. And then they might encourage you to think, well, is there a different way of understanding it? Maybe your friend's busy. Maybe that they didn't want to bother you. And so it kind of it uses those techniques to try and help you think in more constructive ways and act in ways that are more more useful for your well-being. Psychodynamic approaches tend to focus more on the past, and they tend to be a bit less active, and it's more a kind of reflective process with the therapist listening and then helping you make links between what's going on in your present life and then in your past as well, and thinking about how maybe if you get really angry with your partner, is some element of it because you feel angry, or you've got kind of leftover anger from your parents. Maybe you feel they're neglected. Maybe your partner is looking after you, but you tend to see them as neglectful because that's what you experience in your parents. Then you've got the humanistic therapies, which particularly work around trying to create a warm and supportive environment where you can feel very open to talk. I mean, all the therapies would do that, but the humanistic approaches particularly focus on that. And they also use methods to help you get in touch with your emotions quite directly. So they might, for instance, invite you to try something like what's called two-chair work, where you imagine, say, a part of you, like your inner child is sitting on a chair. And then in a therapy session, you'd be working with that and maybe talking to it. And what would you like to say to your inner child? So those are the three main approaches. And then what you also have is you have what's called integrative approaches, which is where people use a mixture of those different kinds of therapies. And a lot of therapists would do that. If you go to the NHS these days, you tend to get CBT because the evidence base is strongest for CBT, although that's partly because that's where most of the research is. So when they compare different therapies tend to do about as well as each other. But when they've just focused on, say, treatments for depression or anxiety or social phobia, there's a lot more evidence for CBT than there is for, say, psychodynamic or humanistic approaches. But if you saw a therapist in privately, they might use a mixture of different approaches, or they might be more humanistic, or they might be more psychodynamic. And again, there's not one best one. They tend to also suit different people at different times. Pluralistic approach is one that I've been involved in developing, which is like a kind of integrative therapy that brings different approaches together, but we particularly try and work with what the client maybe thinks is going to help them. So rather than, and we try and create quite a kind of equal relationship. So rather than a client coming in and us saying as a therapist, right, we're going to do this, this, and this, and this, we would work with clients to think about, well, what's worked before in your life? What do you find useful when you talk to people? And then to develop a particular approach for them that sits with that. Although any good therapy really will kind of work and try and work out what's best for the person. Existential approaches are quite like humanistic approaches, but they also existential philosophy holds that there are certain givens, if you like, certain things about human existence that are kind of fixed, like we all need meaning, and we all have freedom, and we're all going to die. And it provides a space in which clients can explore some of those existential concerns and questions, and it might be more likely to bring them up. I mean, in reality, there's a lot of overlap between the different approaches. So you can see someone who calls themselves psychodynamic, but actually works in a way that's very similar to humanistic, or vice versa, and existential and humanistic overlap. But if you were looking for a therapist, those would be the main kinds of schools that you would see. But when you're thinking about a therapist, what the most important bit is to find somebody who you feel comfortable working with, because, you know, say if you really want to work through stuff in your past, possibly a psychodynamic therapist is going to be more useful. But then you might see a particular psychodynamic therapist and you really might not like them. And the fact they're psychodynamic doesn't mean that they're going to be the right therapist for you. If that relationship doesn't feel good, then that's not a good basis to work from.
I see. Right. And how would somebody know which of those approaches, philosophies, or types of therapists would suit them best?
Well, there's quite a lot of information online, and the main counselling organisation, the BACP, has information. They have a Find a Therapist site, and I think they have details about the different kinds of therapy. I think the NHS site also has information about the different kinds of therapies. You can see some videos on YouTube of the different approaches, and that's not a bad idea to get a sense of what style that you like. I mean, the main difference really is some people like something quite active, and someone who's going to ask a lot of questions and challenge them and give them exercises, and that for them, possibly CBT is going to be the most appropriate approach. If, on the other hand, you're looking for something where you want more space, either probably humanistic or psychodynamic is going to be more useful if really what you want is a space to explore things at your own pace. And particularly if you want to think about things in your past, then psychodynamic can be very good. If you want to work on your kind of relationships and maybe your emotions, and a more humanistic approach. But as I say, it does really depend on the individual practitioner.
I see. So just going back to, I mentioned a bit earlier about kind of America. In America, there's a huge industry for counselling and therapy for people, and it's very common there, isn't it? People regularly sort of go. It's almost part of daily life sometimes to go and see a therapist. Do you think that's a good thing, and do you think that would be beneficial for more countries to have that?
I don't know the
mentality?
statistics on that. I mean, I think that's kind of because of all the sitcoms and
Might be
Fraser
anecdotal.
and
Yeah.
so I'm not sure if that's actually true. It might be true. Is it a good thing? I think what's important is that people feel that there are people in their lives that they can turn to for emotional and psychological support and compassion and care and warmth. And I think as society functions best when we feel that we can do that, rather than having to deal with psychological and emotional problems on our own. I mean, and I think therapists can be part of that network of support that people can feel. Ideally, it would be freely and publicly available. Personally, I think that's really important. That it's not something that only people with the money can afford. And I think in the UK, where there is psychological therapies on the NHS, it's great that is a resource. I wish it was a bit more, maybe there was more of it and it was a bit more diverse, and I hope one day there's more money for that so that people can really feel that. But I think also having groups, one-to-one therapy is not the answer to everything, and I think having groups, having training for kids in schools so that they learn how to support each other, having positive parenting so that parents can bring up kids in an emotionally healthy way, and so that those kids grow up knowing how to be empathic with other people. I think those things are really important as well. And like I was saying earlier, I guess as like most counsellors, I hope we get to a world one day where we don't need counsellors anymore, because people have the emotional skills to support each other to the extent that we all need. But I guess having said that, you're always going to have people who will maybe want and need one-to-one support.
Yeah. And you mentioned about accessibility. How do you think, do you think everybody has some, can benefit in some way by going, even if it's somebody who's not necessarily had anything traumatic in their life, they don't suffer on a day-to-day basis. Do you think, okay.
No, not really. I mean, and I mean, sometimes, for instance, in schools, kids are told to go and see the counsellor because they're behaving badly, as the teacher defines it, or they're sent to see the counsellor, and I don't think that's particularly helpful. For somebody I mean, the most important determinant of whether therapy is helpful to someone is the client themselves, whether they're motivated to do it, whether there's something they want to get out of it. People, if you just go to a therapist thinking, well, I just want someone to cure me, that's often not the best basis. You have to be kind of willing to work at it. And I think that, you know, for very good reason, some people don't want to. And that, you know, that's absolutely fine. So I think it's only, you know, relevant and helpful for people who want it. Or, you know, and there's probably some people who have got problems who may discover that actually it's really helpful. But, you know, I'd hate to think that it was ever imposed on anyone. And as I was saying earlier, I think people can really thrive without it. It's, you know, I think there's a danger of seeing therapy as this kind of distinctive thing rather than seeing it in the context of lots of other mental health and well-being initiatives and public health and education and parenting. It's all part of supporting people. You know, for some people, the best thing for their mental health and well-being is going out for a run. You know, I go running and it absolutely does me the world of good. And if somebody said, you know, I've got to stop running and see a therapist instead, you know, I wouldn't be happy. You know, I love my running, and you know, that works for me. And you know, sometimes when things are difficult or there's particular issues, I go and see a therapist. And you know, that's been quite recently. I saw someone, and that was helpful at times. Sometimes it wasn't so helpful, but it's all part of a kind of complex support network. Is the ideal, really.
Yeah, that theme of a support network, I think, is really important. It ties back to what we talked about loneliness. You know, not feeling like you've got that support or an ear to listen to you. Yeah, I think that's really important. Just going on to the topic of your recent book, then. So, you've talked about these approaches being beneficial. We could apply these approaches at a broader social level. Do you want to just sort of expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I guess so this book, Psychology at the Heart of Social Change, Developing a Progressive Vision for Society. I guess that book is about, is kind of particularly targeted towards a more progressive audience. So it's towards people maybe on the left and kind of Labour, Greens, Liberals. My own background, my own interest is in that kind of more the kind of democratic politics. And what the book's saying really is that to develop a fairer society and a better society in which we can thrive more, that I think psychology has a really important place. And by that, I don't mean in any way kind of therapy and what we've been talking about kind of whisking people off to therapy. But what I mean is I think that there's insights from psychology about what it means to thrive, and what well-being is, and the importance of, as we talked about, relationships and the importance of connection, for instance, that I think if we want to create a fairer, better, more equal society, that are really important to bear in mind. And I think rather than feeling kind of ashamed about these issues, we should think, okay, how can we create a society in which people are able to connect more? Certainly, you know, policymakers, I think that's something that they do think about. It's not kind of revolutionary, but I'd like to see those kind of issues higher up. And I think if they were higher up our agendas, there's a lot of work at the moment around well-being economics and the idea that rather than orienting our society to GDP and kind of economic benefit, we should be starting off by thinking, well, what is it that makes people thrive and happy? And part of that certainly is economic resources. It's not that that's not important, but that shouldn't be the be-all and end-all. The be-all and end-all should be thriving and as many of us being able to thrive as much as possible, thinking about what that means and then thinking about how we get there. And I think psychologists have got a lot to offer, just as sociologists and anthropologists and historians have got a lot to offer about how we think. But I guess going back to something we talked about from the start, there's a bit of people are a bit awkward or uncomfortable maybe talking about psychology and emotions, and it's still seen as quite personal and maybe a little bit too intimate. And, you know, I kind of understand that, but I also think that these issues are really important, that if people are miserable, they're miserable, and that's not a good thing. And, you know, we need to think about how do we create policies that help people be less miserable, because that's what we want, and sometimes that's kind of more implicit than explicit. And part of that's not all psychology then. I mean, partly that is very much about economy. That's about reducing things like racism and homophobia and all these other things that get in the way of people being able to thrive. But part of it is also about social and emotional well-being, and that's what I was saying earlier. I think things like positive parenting, helping people who are having kids learn how to look after them in healthy ways so that they can grow up as emotionally and socially healthy as possible is really important. Social and emotional learning in schools, there's some of that, but it could be vastly developed, I think, and expanded. And also, I think there's something about politicians having a kind of more emotionally literate kind of political system, rather than having politicians kind of squabbling with each other and kind of fighting and putting each other down and trying to shame each other and getting one over on each other. I think if politicians were modeling healthy ways of relating, that would be a really good thing. I think that when we watch Prime Minister's Question Time or any questions or see these debates where people aren't particularly listening to each other, they're trying to score points, they're trying to make the other one feel stupid. I don't think it sets a brilliant precedent for how people should relate. And I think particularly, again, for the kind of slightly more progressive parties that are about cooperation and people working together, it kind of depresses me coming from that angle when they're as competitive and as hostile and as kind of critical as everybody else. I think that a progressive politics that's true to its name should treat others with respect. If socialism or Labour Party is about equality, then surely the first starting point is to see other people as equals and not assume that you're right and everybody else is wrong. That seems a kind of contradiction to me. So that's kind of what my book's about.
Yeah. So it's having that empathy and compassion that we would show to somebody with, that a therapist or a counsellor might show to somebody. It's applying that on a broader scale and setting an example of how we can be towards each other in order to set a good example and make society better and happier, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's skills in learning how to be compassionate and empathic that we can all learn. There's skills that we can learn about how to resolve conflicts in ways that suit all of us. And, those aren't the only life skills, but they're important ones. And it seems to me a real shame that we learn in school about history or geography. We learn about, how atoms work, but we don't learn about how people work. Like, why aren't we learning about these basic things about how to have decent relationships? How to have sex in ways that are respectful and look after each other and make people happy and don't leave people feeling used. Just kind of it feels very unbalanced in many ways, and I guess that's a kind of legacy of the past. But I think there's opportunities now, and we have the knowledge, and there's enough research about certain things that we can be fairly confident that in general there are things that help people feel better. Like the things we've talked about, like connection and physical activity, and we know those, and I think we should be teaching our kids about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, particularly in a world like we talked about earlier, with a lot of communication is digital now, and some of it's anonymous, and you don't know who you're talking to. You don't see the reaction of the person on the other end. You don't, children don't grow up,
and you often don't see the hurt that you're causing.
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of people who do things that are really unpleasant online don't deliberately intend to really hurt somebody, but as you say, there's a disinhibition that's online that means you can just make throwaway comments, and for you it might just feel like you're having a laugh or having fun, but actually can really, really upset somebody. And I think if people have the skills of being able to stand a bit outside themselves, develop what we call kind of mentalizing or ability, so they can stand back and think about what that might be like for someone. And not, the risk is that if you try and teach those things in a way that's kind of critical and, you're a bad person for doing that, that's not really going to help people. And you can't teach compassion by being uncompassionate. It's kind of recognizing that people aren't often meaning to do that, but they can end up doing things in harmful ways, and kind of seeing the good in other people can help create a more compassionate empathic society, and we really need that. I mean, if you look at the world politically at the moment, there's there's massive conflicts that are destroying and killing people, and it's complicated. I mean, you can go up to Putin and start doing compassionate training or something. I don't think you get very far, but hopefully over time people in positions of power will have more compassion and be more able to resolve conflict in ways that are constructive rather than destructive, because we see every day on the news how destructive it is when people aren't able to empathize or and want to have control over others. It's massively destructive.
It is. And I have an optimistic view of society that if we do educate and young people in the right way, bring them up in the right way, everybody has the potential to grow up to be a good functioning person contributing to the world. It's just we need to bring that out of people, instill those life skills like we've talked about, empathy and compassion and a sense of fairness and equality.
Yeah, well, like you said, Paul, at the beginning, there's good evidence that we come into the world as relational beings. With a desire to relate to others and the capacity to relate to others. So there's every reason why we can bring that out in young people. And so I think there is reason to be optimistic, but there's a lot of work to do.
There is, and it starts from the top, doesn't it? And we need the right role models in society. I think that's a good starting point.
I think it starts from the top, but one of the things that you learn in therapy is that we all have some ability to make change happen. And I think that if we wait just for the people at the top to do it, we could be waiting a very long time. There's things that we can all do in our lives, in terms of how we talk to other people and how we relate to other people, trying to do that with compassion and respect and assertiveness as well. It's not just about being nice, and it's not about kind of letting yourself be walked over. It's about also being able to state clearly what's going on for you, and good communication is about being assertive and is about kind of saying if you're unhappy with something about what you're unhappy with, but doing it in a way that's respectful and not, you've done this and this and this to me and you're a bad person, but look, I feel really upset when this happened, and developing those skills. And I think in a way we all need, if we can all take responsibility, and obviously that varies by how much power we have and how much we're able in our lives, but taking that responsibility, I think, is part of what can change and how we can make things better as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, taking responsibility for our own lives, but also, how we treat other people as well.
Yeah,
I think it's both, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm always struck by something is about, I commute to work, and I'm always struck by when I get on the train and when it's a really packed train, and to get everybody on, like people are desperate to get on the train because people don't want to miss the train and be late for work. But often what you have is people who stand like in the opening in such a way that nobody else can move down the train, and that there's like loads of space is lost. And sometimes people don't get on the train because there's people standing there. And I'd love to do a research project one day, just interviewing those people and trying to understand like why they're not moving further down, or why they're not kind of getting out of the way so other people can get on. And I don't think it's something malevolent. I don't think they're thinking, I really hope these other people don't get on the train, so I'm going to make it as difficult as possible for them. But I think there's something about maybe not seeing that as your role. It's like you're kind of hoping or assuming that somebody else is going to sort the problem out. And I think if we all kind of took responsibility for being the one who goes, right, I'm going to move down because, it's a bit of a pain for me, but it means that everybody else can get on. And then the next time when I'm kind of wanting to get on the train, then other people are going to do that for me. It's that kind of taking responsibility that I think we kind of can all do to some extent, and see it as kind of like something that we can make a difference to, not just that it's something else. I think there's a certain, not a badness, but in some psychologists talk about a kind of cognitive laziness that we can kind of assume others or look to others, and none of us, it's nicer not to have to move down the train, but it's worth it.
I sometimes wonder if it's the sort of modern nature of modern life and how stressful it is, and we've got so many things going on in our lives and in our heads. Often people, it might just not occur to people, and they might lose awareness of what's around them, as opposed to being selfish or inconsiderate. It might just be that a symptom of how much more stressful our lives are. Maybe.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that capacity to kind of, when we are stressed, we do get more focused down on what our immediate needs are and what our immediate kind of goals are, rather than being able to think about other people. Whether that's different from what it was, 50, 100 years ago, I don't know. People always say, I think every generation has always said it was better. When I was a kid, it wasn't this bad, and it was better I think it was always better 50 years ago. So, and there's a lot of things that we don't have. We don't have the homophobia that we had 50 years ago, 100 years ago. We don't have the racism. Those things have changed. Things are kind of more equal. More people have got the vote than they were 100. Women have got the vote. Younger people have got the vote. So I think there are kind of a lot of things that have changed over time, and I think there's reasons to be optimistic. But I guess I think you are right that certainly the pressure, everybody, and the busyness is a kind of is a bit of a risk in terms of people just focusing more in on their own personal needs rather than looking out towards others.
Yeah. I wonder if, as time goes on, if our lives do get made easier by, things like, automation and that kind of thing, maybe we might all be able to relax a bit more, and maybe, it might help give a bit more of a altruistic or a more considerate type of society, you would hope.
Yeah, maybe. But it's interesting that I think with computers and with things like emails that have created more efficiency, in some ways, actually things have got even busier and more fast, and the pace just gets faster and faster and faster. I mean, I think there's something about, as human beings, we kind of like to do things. We like to be working on stuff and making things happen, and people have kind of lots of different things that they want to do. And technology in a way allows us to be able to do more, but then we create a rod for our own back, so to speak, by having kind of more to do. So whether technology will make it easier and we can all sit around like the Jetsons and have robots doing all the vacuum cleaning, or whether, we'll still be looking and doing even more and trying to do more because there's more that we can do, I guess kind of remains to be seen.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. Just on another slightly related topic, do you have a view on meditation as a way of, or mindfulness, or that kind of, what impact does that have?
Good. It's good. I mean, the research shows it can be really helpful for people with things like kind of chronic depression. There's good evidence for it, and certainly there's a lot of kind of mindfulness-based therapies now that have a good evidence base. But it is also very individual. I mean, I don't personally. I've tried it a few times, and I just can't get with it, and my mind races off, within a few minutes. Now, whether actually I'd be better off kind of really staying with it and learning it, and it'd be useful for me, or whether it just doesn't suit me, I don't know. But I think it's with any of these things that it's a bit of a risk saying it's good for everybody. But on average, it is good. On average, it is one of the kind of new so-called therapies. And obviously it's not new, but as a therapy, kind of as part of the kind of Western, it's been around for, thousands of years, I think. I don't know the history of it, but as a kind of formal therapy used, it seems to be doing some good work. And similar things around yoga, for instance, is another one that I think people are beginning to recognize has a real potential as a kind of therapeutic benefit. And it's popular, kids like it. Some kids like it, some people really don't like it. Do you like it?
I'm the same as you. I tried it and it didn't do much for me. So I didn't really return to it, but I'm always open-minded. I mean, I might not have just done it right. I don't know, but I'll return to it one day and see what effect it has. But you wonder also to what extent it could be a bit of a placebo as well.
It's difficult with the psychological therapies to really ever test them against I mean, if you got drugs and you're testing drugs, you can give somebody something that looks exactly like the drug, and then you can see whether the active ingredient makes a difference. Whereas in therapy, there's always that placebo effect that you can't kind of control for. But in a sense, whether it's placebo or not, the fact that it's reducing depression, the fact that it's making people kind of better is a good thing. So I'm not too cynical about it personally, even though it kind of doesn't work for me. I think it's like a kind of toolbox or a kind of arsenal. The more things we have, the better it is, because people are going to need different things, and if there's more options, as long as there's guidance as well to help people choose the one that might work best for themselves, I think that's all to the good.
Yeah, I think so. Mick, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I've learned an absolute bundle about all this. So thank you very much for taking the time to chat to me and answering all my questions.
Thanks, Paul. Good to talk to you.
Thanks for watching. There's going to be more episodes coming up. You can also listen on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and that sort of thing. Until next time, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you again soon.